The sound of a gavel crashing against wood echoed through the crowded auction house in Oro Blanco, Arizona Territory, 1878, as Madeline Foster's future was sold to the highest bidder. Her hands trembled as she stood on the makeshift platform, the hot summer air suffocating her as surely as the shame that colored her cheeks. $500 for the Foster girl, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying across the room filled with men whose hungry eyes made her skin crawl. Her father's debts will be cleared and she'll serve for 3 years. Do I hear 600? Madeline fought back tears as she scanned the crowd. Just 3 days ago, she had been helping her mother with the washing, dreaming of opening her own dressmaking shop someday. Now, at 20 years old, she was being sold like cattle to cover her father's gambling debts. After his death from fever last month, the creditors had descended like vultures, demanding payment her family couldn't provide. 600, called a voice from the back. 700, countered another. Her mother stood in the corner, weeping silently, clutching Madeline's younger sister to her side. They had no choice. It was either Madeline's servitude or losing their small farm altogether. $800, came a deep voice that silenced the room. The crowd parted as a tall man strode forward, his spurs jingling with each purposeful step. Dust clung to his worn denim pants and cotton shirt, and his sun-bronzed face spoke of days spent in the saddle. He was perhaps 30, with eyes the color of a summer storm and a jaw set with determination. "Mr. Nathanson," the auctioneer acknowledged with a respectful nod. "800 from Grant Nathanson. Do I hear 9? The room fell silent. Everyone in Oro Blanco knew Grant Nathanson owned the largest cattle ranch in the county. No one dared challenge him. 800 going once. Twice, sold to Mr. Nathanson. Madeline's knees nearly buckled as the rancher approached the platform, his expression unreadable as he handed over a stack of bills to the auctioneer. He glanced up at her, then extended his hand. "Come along, Miss Foster," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. With trembling legs, Madeline descended the steps. Her mother rushed forward, embracing her one last time. "Be strong, my darling," her mother whispered, pressing something small and hard into Madeline's palm, her grandmother's silver locket. "I'll find a way to buy back your contract, I promise." Madeline nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She followed Grant Nathanson outside to where his horse was hitched alongside a small wagon. "You'll ride with me," he said, helping her up onto the bench seat before climbing up beside her. With a flick of the reins, they were moving away from town, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the dusty road. They traveled in silence for nearly half an hour before Madeline found her voice. "What kind of work will you have me do, Mr. Nathanson?" She asked quietly, staring at her folded hands. Grant glanced at her. "None." Madeline's head snapped up. "I don't understand." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his profile sharp against the darkening sky. "I'm not taking you to work for me, Miss Foster. I'm taking you to my ranch because it was the only way to stop those vultures back there from bidding on you. But you paid $800, Madeline said, confusion evident in her voice. "I did." He guided the horses around a bend in the road. "And as soon as we reach my ranch, I'll be tearing up that contract." Madeline stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Tearing it up?" Grant Nathanson finally turned to look at her, his expression softening slightly. "I have no interest in owning another human being, Miss Foster. What happened back there shouldn't be legal, but unfortunately in these parts it is." He returned his attention to the road. "I'm offering you your freedom instead of ownership." Madeline felt dizzy with disbelief. "But why? You don't even know me." The rancher was quiet for a moment. "I knew your father, Miss Foster. He wasn't a bad man, just weak when it came to cards and whiskey." His hands tightened on the reins. "No one deserves to pay for another's mistakes that way, especially not a young woman with her whole life ahead of her." Tears welled in Madeline's eyes. "I don't know how I could ever repay such kindness." "You don't need to," Grant replied simply, "but you'll need somewhere to stay and work if you want it. My housekeeper could use help, and I understand you're skilled with a needle and thread." Madeline wiped away her tears with the back of her hand. "Yes, I am. I would be grateful for any work you might have." Then it's settled. You'll stay at the ranch until you decide what you want to do next, as a free woman, Miss Foster, not as property." As the wagon crested a hill, Madeline saw the sprawling Nathanson ranch spread out below them, the main house glowing with lamplight in the gathering dusk. For the first time that day, a small spark of hope flickered in her chest. What Madeline couldn't know was that Grant Nathanson had his own reasons for what he'd done, reasons that went beyond simple kindness, tied to promises made and a debt of honor that ran deeper than money ever could. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the main house, a substantial two-story structure built of timber and stone. Several ranch hands looked up from their evening chores, curiosity evident in their expressions as they spotted Madeline. "Mrs. Prescott will get you settled," Grant said as he helped Madeline down from the wagon. "She's been my housekeeper since I was a boy." As if summoned by his words, the front door opened, and an older woman with silver-streaked hair and a kind face stepped onto the porch. She wore a simple dark dress with an apron tied around her ample waist. "Mr. Nathanson, you're back earlier than expected," she said, her gaze shifting to Madeline with evident curiosity. "Mrs. Prescott, this is Miss Madeline Foster. She'll be staying with us for a while and helping you around the house if that suits you." The older woman's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. "Of course, we can certainly use the help." She smiled warmly at Madeline. "Come inside, dear, you look exhausted." Grant retrieved a small bundle from the back of the wagon, Madeline's few possessions that her mother had hastily packed. "I have some business to attend to. Mrs. Prescott will show you to your room." Before Madeline could thank him again, he had handed her bundle to Mrs. Prescott and was striding toward the barn, calling to one of his ranch hands. Mrs. Prescott led Madeline into the house. Inside, the main room was spacious and surprisingly comfortable, with sturdy furniture, colorful woven rugs, and bookshelves lining one wall. A large stone fireplace dominated one end of the room, currently unlit in the summer heat. "This is quite a lovely home," Madeline remarked. "Mr. Nathanson's father built it for his mother," Mrs. Prescott explained as she led Madeline up a staircase. "He spared no expense. They're both gone now, God rest their souls, but Grant has kept everything just as they left it." They reached the top of the stairs, and Mrs. Prescott guided her down a hallway to a small but pleasant room at the back of the house. It contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. A window overlooked the corral and the mountains beyond. "This will be your room," Mrs. Prescott said, placing Madeline's bundle on the bed. "The bathroom is down the hall. We're fortunate that old Mr. Nathanson insisted on indoor plumbing, quite the luxury out here." Madeline stood in the center of the room, still struggling to comprehend the sudden turn her fortunes had taken. Just hours ago, she had been standing on an auction block, and now she was being treated as an honored guest. "Mrs. Prescott, I don't understand why Mr. Nathanson is being so kind to me," she said softly. The housekeeper's expression softened. "Grant Nathanson is a man of few words but deep principles, Miss Foster. Whatever his reasons, you can be sure they're honorable." She patted Madeline's arm. "Now you should rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to talk about your duties." After Mrs. Prescott left, Madeline sat on the edge of the bed, fingering her grandmother's locket. The events of the day had left her emotionally drained, yet her mind was too full for sleep. She moved to the window and looked out at the vast landscape, silvered by the rising moon. In the corral below, she could see Grant Nathanson talking with several of his men. Even from this distance, there was something compelling about him, a quiet authority that commanded respect. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but there was strength in his features and a kindness in his eyes that she had glimpsed during their journey. Madeline wondered about the debt of honor he had mentioned regarding her father. Her father had never spoken of Grant Nathanson. What connection could they possibly have had? As the men dispersed, and Grant walked back toward the house alone, Madeline stepped back from the window, not wanting to be caught watching. Whatever his reasons, she owed this man her freedom, and she would find a way to express her gratitude, even if it took years of loyal service to do so. Morning came with the crowing of roosters and the distant lowing of cattle. Madeline woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. The events of the previous day came rushing back, and she sat up, clutching the quilt to her chest. She washed and dressed quickly in one of her two simple dresses, then made her way downstairs. The house was already bustling with activity. In the kitchen, she found Mrs. Prescott preparing breakfast, the aroma of coffee and frying bacon filling the air. "Good morning, Miss Foster," the housekeeper greeted her. "I hope you slept well." "Yes, thank you," Madeline replied, though in truth her sleep had been fitful, filled with dreams of auction blocks and faceless bidders. "Please call me Madeline, and I'd like to help." Mrs. Prescott handed her an apron. "You can set the table, the men will be in shortly." Madeline busied herself with plates and utensils, learning that breakfast at the Nathanson ranch was served to the ranch hands as well as the owner. Grant, she discovered, preferred to eat with his men rather than apart from them. When the men filed in, they were polite but curious, tipping their hats to her and introducing themselves. Grant was the last to enter, and he nodded to Madeline as he took his seat at the head of the long table. "Miss Foster," he acknowledged, "I trust you found your accommodations satisfactory." "Very much so, Mr. Nathanson," she answered, "and I'm eager to begin earning my keep." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "We'll discuss that after breakfast." The meal passed with talk of cattle, weather, and ranch business. Madeline observed Grant with his men, noting the easy respect that flowed between them. These weren't employees afraid of a harsh master. They were men who genuinely respected their employer. After breakfast, while Mrs. Prescott and Madeline cleared the table, Grant asked Madeline to join him in his study when she was finished. 20 minutes later, she knocked tentatively on the door he had indicated. "Come in," came his deep voice. Madeline entered a room lined with more bookshelves, a large desk positioned before windows that overlooked the ranch. Grant stood by one of these windows, hands clasped behind his back. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair before his desk as he took his own seat. When they were both seated, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a document, her contract of indenture. "As promised," he said, tearing the paper in half, then quarters, then eighths. "You are under no obligation to me or anyone else, Miss Foster." Madeline stared at the torn pieces, a lump forming in her throat. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary." Grant leaned back in his chair. "Now, as for your position here, if you still wish to stay, Mrs. Prescott could use help with the housekeeping, cooking, and mending." "I understand from your mother that you're quite skilled with a needle." Madeline nodded. "Yes, I've been sewing since I was a child. My mother taught me." "Good. I have 15 men working this ranch, and they're hard on their clothes. Mrs. Prescott's eyesight isn't what it used to be for fine work." He opened another drawer and took out a small pouch, placing it on the desk between them. "This is your first month's wages in advance." Madeline stared at the pouch, then back at Grant. "But I haven't earned anything yet." "You will." His gray eyes held her steadily. "You're free to leave whenever you wish, Miss Foster, but I hope you'll stay, at least until you decide what you want to do next. Oro Blanco isn't the easiest place for a young woman alone." Madeline thought of her mother and sister, struggling to keep their small farm without her help. "Mr. Nathanson, would it be possible? That is, could I send some of my wages to my mother? She and my sister, of course," Grant interrupted. "In fact, I've already sent a man to inform your mother of your whereabouts and to deliver some supplies. I thought she might be worried." Tears welled in Madeline's eyes at his thoughtfulness. "You've been so kind. I still don't understand why." Grant's expression grew solemn. "Let's just say I'm repaying a debt." He rose from his chair, indicating their conversation was at an end. "Mrs. Prescott will show you your duties. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." As Madeline left the study, clutching the pouch of coins, she was more confused than ever about Grant Nathanson. What debt could he possibly be repaying, and why did his kindness make her heart beat just a little faster when he looked at her with those storm-gray eyes? The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Madeline settled into life at the Nathanson ranch. She rose early each morning, helping Mrs. Prescott prepare breakfast for the ranch hands before tackling her housekeeping duties. In the afternoons, she often sat on the back porch, mending shirts and trousers while listening to the distant sounds of cattle and men at work. Grant was frequently absent, riding out at dawn and returning at dusk, his face bronzed by the sun and often etched with fatigue. When he was present, he was unfailingly polite to Madeline but maintained a careful distance. Their conversations were brief and centered on household matters or her comfort. One evening, nearly a month after her arrival, Madeline was sitting on the back porch, her sewing basket beside her, when she heard approaching hoofbeats. Looking up, she saw Grant riding in, but something was wrong. He was slumped in the saddle, one hand pressed to his side. Dropping her mending, Madeline rushed down the steps as Grant dismounted unsteadily. As she reached him, she saw blood seeping between his fingers. "Mr. Nathanson, you're hurt," Grant grimaced. "It's nothing, just a disagreement with a fence post." But as he took a step forward, his legs gave way, and he would have fallen if Madeline hadn't caught him, bearing his weight as best she could. "Mrs. Prescott," Madeline called. "Come quickly." Between the two women, they managed to get Grant into the house and onto the sofa in the main room. Mrs. Prescott hurried to fetch water and bandages while Madeline helped Grant remove his bloodied shirt. A deep gash ran along his ribs, still bleeding freely. "This doesn't look like a fence post, did it?" Madeline said, pressing a clean cloth against the wound. Grant winced. "Perhaps it had help from a stray piece of barbed wire." Mrs. Prescott returned with supplies, clucking her tongue at the injury. "This needs stitching, Mr. Nathanson. Shall I send for Dr. Miller from town?" Grant shook his head. "No need to bother him for this." His eyes met Madeline's. "Miss Foster is handy with a needle, isn't she?" Madeline's eyes widened. "Mr. Nathanson, I've never stitched a person before. Not much different from fabric, I'd imagine," he said with a faint smile that didn't quite mask his pain. "And I trust your hand is steadier than Mrs. Prescott's." Mrs. Prescott harumphed but didn't disagree. "I'll fetch your father's whiskey, Mr. Nathanson, for medicinal purposes." Left alone with Grant, Madeline carefully cleaned the wound, trying to ignore the way his muscles tensed under her touch. He was leaner than his clothes suggested, all sinew and strength. Mrs. Prescott returned with a bottle and a needle already threaded. After Grant had taken a long swig of whiskey, Madeline steeled herself for the task. "This will hurt," she warned. Grant's eyes met hers. "I trust you, Miss Foster." Something in his gaze made her heart skip a beat, but she focused on the task at hand. With careful precision, she began to stitch the wound, wincing inwardly each time the needle pierced his skin. Grant remained stoically silent, though she could feel the tension in his body. When she had finished, she sat back, examining her handiwork. The stitches were small and even, closing the wound neatly. "You would have made a fine doctor, Miss Foster," Grant said, his voice slightly rough from the whiskey and pain. Madeline smiled as she began bandaging his torso. "I don't think they allow women to be doctors, Mr. Nathanson." "Their loss," he murmured, watching her hands as they worked. "You have a gentle touch." Madeline felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "Thank you for trusting me." When she had finished, Mrs. Prescott helped Grant to his feet and up to his room to rest. Later that evening, as Madeline was preparing to retire herself, there was a knock at her bedroom door. Mrs. Prescott stood there, a small smile on her face. "Mr. Nathanson asked me to thank you again for your assistance. He also wanted you to have this." She handed Madeline a small, leather-bound book. Opening it, Madeline discovered it was a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson. "He said he noticed you looking at it in the library," Mrs. Prescott explained. "It was his mother's." Madeline ran her fingers over the embossed cover, touched by the gesture. "That's very kind of him." Mrs. Prescott's eyes twinkled. "Grant Nathanson is a kind man, Miss Foster, though he doesn't always know how to show it." After the housekeeper had gone, Madeline sat on her bed, leafing through the book of poems. Inside the front cover was an inscription. "To my beloved wife, Elizabeth, may these words bring you joy when I am away. All my love, James." Madeline felt a pang of sadness, wondering about the woman who had once owned this book and the man who had loved her enough to write such tender words. Grant had clearly inherited his father's generous spirit. As she drifted off to sleep that night, the book of poems beside her, Madeline found herself thinking of Grant's gray eyes and the way they had looked at her with such trust as she tended his wound. Something had shifted between them today, something subtle but undeniable. And somewhere deep in her heart, a feeling she didn't dare name had begun to take root. The days following Grant's injury brought a change to the routine of the ranch. Confined to the house to allow his wound to heal, Grant spent more time in Madeline's company than he had since her arrival. At first, their interactions were awkward, both of them unused to the sudden proximity. Madeline would bring him his meals in the study, where he insisted on continuing to work despite Mrs. Prescott's scolding. She would change his bandages daily, her fingers gentle as they skimmed over the healing wound. "You're fortunate it's healing so cleanly," she remarked one afternoon as she applied a fresh bandage. "No sign of infection." "Thanks to your skilled handiwork," Grant replied, watching her face as she concentrated on her task. "Where did you learn to be so capable, Miss Foster?" Madeline secured the bandage before answering. "My mother taught me most of what I know, with my father often." "A way we had to manage for ourselves." Grant's expression darkened slightly at the mention of her father. "I'm sorry your father wasn't more present." "He tried in his way," Madeline said, packing away the medical supplies, "but he had demons he couldn't outrun." "Gambling and drink," Grant said quietly. Madeline looked up, surprised. "You mentioned knowing him before. How well did you know my father, Mr. Nathanson?" Grant was silent for a moment, as if weighing his words. "Well enough to know he was more than his vices." He shifted in his chair, grimacing slightly as the movement pulled at his stitches. "Miss Foster, there's something I should tell you, but they were interrupted by Mrs. Prescott, who bustled in with coffee. Miss Foster, when you're finished here, there's a delivery from town that needs your attention." The moment was lost, and Grant didn't attempt to return to the subject in the days that followed. Instead, they fell into a new routine. In the evenings, after dinner, they would often sit in the main room, Grant reading reports or correspondence while Madeline worked on her mending. Sometimes he would read aloud from the newspaper, discussing the events of the wider world with her. Madeline discovered that Grant was well educated, with opinions on everything from politics to literature. He listened to her views with genuine interest, never dismissing them as many men might have done. One evening, as a summer storm raged outside, Madeline found Grant standing at the window of the main room, watching the lightning split the sky. "It's magnificent, isn't it?" he said without turning as she entered the room. Madeline moved to stand beside him, gazing out at the dramatic display. "Terrifying and beautiful at once. Nature's reminder of our insignificance," Grant mused. "All our striving and building, and a single storm can wash it away." "That's rather melancholy," Madeline observed. Grant turned to look at her, a half-smile softening his features. "Is it?" "I find it comforting, actually, to know that the world is bigger than our troubles." A crack of thunder shook the house, and Madeline jumped involuntarily. Without thinking, Grant placed a steadying hand on her arm. The touch, warm through the fabric of her sleeve, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. They stood like that for a moment, close enough that Madeline could smell the faint scent of soap and leather that seemed to cling to him. Then Grant gently released her and stepped back. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "There's nothing to forgive," Madeline replied, her voice barely audible over the rain lashing against the windows. Something flickered in Grant's eyes, something that made Madeline's heart race before he looked away. "It's getting late. You should rest, Miss Foster." Madeline nodded, though rest was the furthest thing from her mind. "Good night, Mr. Nathanson." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Madeline's thoughts were in turmoil. She had come to respect Grant Nathanson deeply over the past weeks, grateful for his kindness and impressed by his integrity. But what she was beginning to feel went beyond respect or gratitude. It was dangerous, she knew, to harbor such feelings for a man like Grant. He was her employer, her benefactor. And despite his kindness, he maintained a careful distance between them, as if there were boundaries he dared not cross. Still, as she lay in bed listening to the storm, Madeline couldn't help but remember the warmth of his hand on her arm and the look in his eyes just before he had pulled away. There had been something there, something that suggested she might not be alone in her growing feelings. But what future could there possibly be for a poor farmer's daughter and one of the wealthiest ranchers in the territory? The thought was too fanciful to entertain. Madeline decided, turning over and willing herself to sleep as the storm continued its assault on the night. The following week, a letter arrived from Madeline's mother. Grant handed it to her himself, having ridden into town that morning. "Thank you," Madeline said, her fingers tracing her mother's familiar handwriting on the envelope. "I've been wondering how they're managing." "Open it," Grant encouraged. "I'll give you some privacy," but Madeline shook her head. "There's no need for that." She broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper. As she read, her expression changed from anticipation to distress. "What is it?" Grant asked, concern evident in his voice. Madeline looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "The bank is foreclosing on our farm. Mother and Susan will have nowhere to go." Grant's jaw tightened. "When?" "2 weeks," Madeline said, scanning the letter again. "She says not to worry, that she'll find something, but—" She trailed off, knowing the prospects for a widow and a young girl were grim. Grant was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Would they consider coming here?" "There's more than enough room, and your sister could attend the school in town." Madeline stared at him in disbelief. "You would do that? Why not? Mrs. Prescott would welcome the company, I'm sure, and it would ease your mind to have them near." Impulsively, Madeline reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Nathanson. You are the most generous man I've ever known." Something flickered in Grant's eyes at her touch, something like pain, before he gently withdrew his hand. "It's no hardship, Miss Foster. Write to your mother today. I'll send one of the men to deliver it." As Grant left the room, Madeline watched him go, confusion mingling with gratitude. His continual kindness toward her family was extraordinary, yet every time she tried to express her appreciation, he retreated as if her gratitude made him uncomfortable. What debt could possibly warrant such generosity? And why did he still keep parts of himself hidden from her, even as they grew closer in other ways? 3 days later, a wagon arrived at the ranch carrying Madeline's mother, Rebecca Foster, and her 13-year-old sister, Susan. Madeline rushed out to meet them, embracing them both with tears of joy. "I can't believe you're here," she said, holding her mother at arm's length to look at her. Rebecca Foster was thin and careworn, but her smile was warm as ever. "Thanks to your Mr. Nathanson," Rebecca replied, glancing past Madeline to where Grant stood on the porch. "He's been more than generous." "He's not my Mr. Nathanson, mother," Madeline whispered, feeling her cheeks warm. Rebecca gave her a knowing look. "If you say so, my dear." Grant stepped forward to welcome them, helping Rebecca down from the wagon with courteous efficiency. "Mrs. Foster, Miss Susan, welcome to the Nathanson Ranch. I hope your journey wasn't too taxing." "Not at all, Mr. Nathanson," Rebecca replied. "And I can't thank you enough for your hospitality." "No thanks necessary," Grant said, the phrase Madeline had heard so often. "Please come inside. Mrs. Prescott has prepared refreshments, and I'm sure you'd like to rest after your journey." As they entered the house, Madeline noticed her mother studying Grant with a curious expression. Later, when they were alone in the room that Susan and Rebecca would share, Madeline questioned her about it. "You were looking at Mr. Nathanson strangely, Mother. Do you know him from somewhere?" Rebecca hesitated, smoothing the quilt on the bed. "I've never met him before today, but your father spoke of him once or twice. They served together briefly during the war." "The war? Father never talked about his service," Madeline said, surprised. "No, he didn't like to remember those days," Rebecca agreed. "But he did mention a young lieutenant named Nathanson who saved several men in their company during a surprise attack." Madeline absorbed this information thoughtfully. "So that's the debt he feels he owes." "But it should be the other way around, shouldn't it? If Mr. Nathanson saved Father's life," Rebecca gave her daughter a penetrating look. "Perhaps there's more to the story than I know. Your father wasn't always forthcoming about his past." She changed the subject abruptly. "Mr. Nathanson seems like a good man, and he clearly thinks highly of you." "He's my employer, Mother," Madeline said, though she couldn't quite meet her mother's eyes. "Is that all?" Rebecca asked gently. Madeline busied herself with unpacking her mother's trunk. "It has to be." "Mr. Nathanson is. He's far above my station, and he's never given any indication that he sees me as anything more than an employee he feels responsible for." Rebecca watched her daughter's face carefully. "I see." The addition of Madeline's family to the household brought a new warmth to the Nathanson ranch. Susan, bright and curious, charmed everyone with her questions and enthusiasm. Rebecca, after insisting she couldn't remain idle, took over much of the cooking from Mrs. Prescott, who gratefully focused on her other duties. Grant, to Madeline's surprise, seemed to enjoy the livelier atmosphere. He often engaged Susan in conversations about her studies, recommending books from his library and patiently answering her endless questions about ranching. With Rebecca, he was unfailingly respectful, seeking her opinion on household matters and listening attentively when she spoke. But it was with Madeline that the most significant change occurred. The careful distance Grant had maintained began to erode, almost imperceptibly at first. Their conversations lingered longer. His smiles came more readily. Sometimes, Madeline would look up from her work to find his eyes on her, an expression in them that made her breath catch. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after her family's arrival, Madeline was hanging laundry in the yard when Grant approached, leading 2 saddled horses. "Miss Foster," he called, "could you spare an hour? There's something I'd like to show you." Madeline glanced at the half-empty laundry basket. "I should finish this first." "Your mother offered to complete it," Grant said. "She thought you might enjoy a break." Madeline saw her mother watching from the kitchen window, a knowing smile on her face. "Did she now?" Grant's lips twitched. "She might have suggested I could use some company." "I see conspiracy is afoot," Madeline said, but she was smiling as she untied her apron. "Let me change my shoes and I'll join you." A few minutes later, they were riding away from the ranch house, Madeline seated comfortably on a gentle mare while Grant rode his usual stallion. They followed a trail that wound up into the foothills, the landscape changing from open rangeland to scattered pine trees as they climbed. "Where are we going?" Madeline asked after they had ridden in companionable silence for some time. "Somewhere special," Grant replied cryptically. "Not much farther now." True to his word, they soon emerged from a stand of trees into a small, hidden meadow. Wildflowers carpeted the ground in a riot of colors, and a small stream bubbled along one edge. The view from this elevation was spectacular, encompassing the entire valley where the Nathanson ranch sat, with the distant mountains providing a majestic backdrop. "Oh," Madeline breathed, reining in her horse to take in the scene. "It's beautiful." Grant dismounted and came to help her down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. When her feet touched the ground, he didn't immediately step back, and for a moment they stood close enough that Madeline could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. Then he released her and turned toward the meadow. "My mother used to bring me here when I was a boy. It was her favorite place on the ranch." Madeline followed him to the edge of the meadow where they sat on a fallen log. "Thank you for sharing it with me." Grant nodded, looking out over the valley. "I haven't brought anyone here since she died. It didn't seem right somehow." The significance of his words wasn't lost on Madeline. "What was she like, your mother?" A smile softened Grant's features. "Strong, kind. Stubborn when she believed in something." He glanced at Madeline. "You remind me of her sometimes." Madeline felt a flush of pleasure at the comparison. "And your father, a good man, hard-working, he built this ranch from nothing." Grant's expression grew distant. He had high expectations of himself, of others, but he was fair. "They sound like wonderful people," Madeline said softly. They were. Grant picked up a small stone, turning it over in his hands. "They died within a year of each other. Mother from fever, father from what the doctor called heart failure, though I think it was more a case of a broken heart." "I'm sorry," Madeline said, instinctively reaching out to touch his arm. Grant looked down at her hand, then covered it with his own. "Don't be. I had them longer than many are fortunate enough to have their parents, and they taught me what matters in life." "And what's that?" Madeline asked, acutely aware of his warm hand over hers. "Honor, compassion, doing what's right even when it's difficult." His eyes met hers, serious and searching. "They taught me that wealth means nothing without those things." In that moment, with the sun dappling through the trees and the wildflowers nodding in the gentle breeze, Madeline felt something shift between them, something fundamental and irrevocable. Grant must have felt it too, for he slowly withdrew his hand and stood up. "We should head back. Your mother will worry." The ride back to the ranch was quieter, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the house, Grant finally broke the silence. Miss Foster Madeline, he said, using her given name for the first time, there's something I need to tell you about your father. Madeline's heart quickened. What about him? But before Grant could continue, they were interrupted by the arrival of a rider galloping toward the ranch, dust billowing behind him. It was one of Grant's men, and from his urgency, something was wrong. Mr. Nathanson, the man called as he reached them. Trouble in town. The bank's been robbed, and they're saying Hank Dawson's gang is responsible. Sheriff's looking for volunteers to ride after them. Grant's expression hardened. How long ago? Less than 2 hours. They headed north toward the territorial line. Grant turned to Madeline. I'm sorry, but I need to go. We'll talk when I return. Before Madeline could protest, he was issuing orders to his man and turning his horse toward the stables. Within 20 minutes, Grant and 5 of his ranch hands were armed and riding hard toward town. Madeline stood on the porch, watching them disappear in a cloud of dust, a sense of foreboding settling over her. What had Grant been about to tell her about her father, and why did she have the terrible feeling that he might not return to finish the conversation? 3 days passed with no word from Grant or his men. The waiting was unbearable. Madeline tried to keep busy with her usual duties, but her mind constantly wandered to Grant and the danger he might be facing. On the morning of the 4th day, Rebecca found Madeline in the kitchen, staring absently out the window. He'll come back, Rebecca said gently, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Madeline started. I don't know what you mean. Rebecca smiled knowingly. Yes, you do. You care for him, Madeline, more than you want to admit, even to yourself. Madeline sighed, giving up the pretense. It doesn't matter, he's my employer, nothing more. Is that what you truly believe? Rebecca asked, because I've seen the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. Before Madeline could respond, they heard the sound of approaching horses. She rushed to the front porch, her heart pounding. It was Grant and his men, dusty and weary but seemingly unharmed. As they dismounted, Madeline noticed that Grant's expression was grim and there was blood on his shirt. Are you hurt? She asked as he reached the porch. Grant shook his head. Not mine, Dawson's. You caught them. Yes, they put up a fight, but we managed to capture most of them alive. The sheriff has them in custody now. Grant's eyes met hers, and the weariness in them made her heart ache. I need to clean up. Madeline nodded, stepping aside to let him enter the house. As he passed, his hand brushed hers briefly, deliberately, she thought, before he continued inside. An hour later, bathed and in clean clothes, Grant found Madeline in the garden, harvesting vegetables for dinner. May I join you? He asked quietly. Madeline nodded, setting down her basket. They walked together to a wooden bench beneath an apple tree, its branches heavy with ripening fruit. I believe I was about to tell you something when we were interrupted, Grant said after they were seated. Madeline's hands twisted in her lap. About my father. Yes, Grant took a deep breath. What I'm about to tell you may change how you think of him and of me, but I believe you deserve the truth. You're frightening me, Mr. Nathanson. Grant, he corrected gently. Please call me Grant. Madeline nodded. Grant. His name on her lips seemed to give him courage. Your mother mentioned that your father and I served together in the war. That's true, but it's not the whole story. He paused, looking out over the garden. We were in the same company for less than a year. There was a battle, a terrible one. Many men died. Madeline listened intently, trying to reconcile this history with what little she knew of her father's past. During the chaos, Grant continued, I was separated from my unit. I found myself alone, surrounded by enemy soldiers. I thought I was going to die there. His voice grew quieter. Your father found me. He could have kept going, saved himself, but he didn't. He came back for me, helped me to safety despite his own wounds. Madeline's eyes widened. So it was father who saved you, not the other way around. Grant nodded. I owed him my life. We lost touch after the war, but I never forgot what he did. When I heard he had died and that you were being sold to cover his debts, he met her eyes directly. I couldn't let that happen to the daughter of the man who saved me. I had to help. So that's why, Madeline whispered. All this time, your kindness was because you felt you owed my father a debt. Something flickered in Grant's eyes, pain, perhaps, or frustration. At first, yes, I won't deny that, but Madeline. He reached out, taking her hand in his. That's not why I continue to care for you and your family now. Madeline looked down at their joined hands, then back at his face. Why then? Grant's expression softened, vulnerability replacing the usual reserve in his eyes. Because somewhere along the way, between tearing up your contract and watching you mend my shirts, I fell in love with you. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. What? I love you, Madeline Foster, Grant said simply. Your strength, your kindness, your quiet dignity. I've been fighting it, telling myself it was inappropriate given our circumstances, but I can't deny it any longer. His grip on her hand tightened slightly. I understand if you don't feel the same way. Your gratitude might have colored your perception of me, and I wouldn't want you to confuse that with. Madeline leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, effectively silencing him. The kiss was brief but unmistakable in its meaning. When she pulled back, Grant looked stunned. Does that mean? It means I love you too, Madeline said, her cheeks flushed but her gaze steady. Not out of gratitude, but because of who you are. I think I've loved you since the day you tore up my contract and offered me freedom instead of ownership. Grant's face broke into a smile more radiant than any Madeline had seen from him before. He cupped her cheek with his hand, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. I never dared to hope, he murmured. Nor I, Madeline admitted. I thought you saw me only as an obligation, or at best, an employee. Grant shook his head, drawing her closer. Never just an obligation, never just an employee. His arms encircled her waist. You are the most remarkable woman I've ever known, Madeline Foster. This time when they kissed, it was deeper, a true expression of the feelings they had both been harboring. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Grant rested his forehead against hers. I should speak with your mother, he said. Madeline smiled. I think she already knows. She's been watching us like a hawk these past weeks, Grant chuckled. Nonetheless, I want to do this properly. He pulled back slightly, his expression growing serious. Madeline, I know this is sudden and perhaps I should wait, court you properly first, but Grant Nathanson, Madeline interrupted, her eyes sparkling with joy and mischief. Are you about to propose to me in my mother's vegetable garden? I am, he confirmed, a smile tugging at his lips. Unless you'd prefer I wait. I would not, Madeline said firmly. Grant laughed, then grew serious again. Taking both her hands in his, he looked into her eyes. Madeline Foster, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? I promise to cherish you, respect you, and love you all the days of my life. Tears of happiness welled in Madeline's eyes. Yes, she whispered. With all my heart, yes. Grant's smile was radiant as he pulled her close for another kiss, this one a promise of the life they would build together. From the kitchen window, Rebecca Foster watched her daughter in the arms of Grant Nathanson, a smile of contentment on her face. Beside her, Mrs. Prescott wiped a tear from her eye. About time, the housekeeper murmured. Rebecca nodded. Indeed it is. The news of their engagement spread quickly through the ranch and then to the town of Oro Blanco. Most received it with joy and congratulations, though there were a few raised eyebrows at the match between the wealthy rancher and the girl who had once stood on an auction block. Grant and Madeline paid little attention to such whispers, too wrapped up in their happiness and plans for the future. They decided on a short engagement, with the wedding to take place in the garden of the ranch house as autumn painted the surrounding hills in gold and crimson. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Madeline worked on her dress, using fine fabric that Grant had ordered from San Francisco. Her mother and sister helped, the three of them sewing late into the evening while sharing stories and laughter. Grant, meanwhile, threw himself into preparations of his own, overseeing the construction of an addition to the house for Rebecca and Susan, and renovating the master bedroom that had belonged to his parents, which would soon be his and Madeline's. One evening, a week before the wedding, Grant found Madeline on the porch, gazing at the sunset. A penny for your thoughts, he said, sitting beside her. Madeline smiled, leaning against him as his arm encircled her shoulders. I was thinking about that day at the auction house. How certain I was that my life was over. She turned to look at him. I never imagined then that it was actually just beginning. Grant pressed a kiss to her temple. For both of us, I'd resigned myself to running this ranch alone, never sharing my life with anyone. His arm tightened around her. Now I can't imagine a day without you. Do you think your parents would have approved? Madeline asked softly. I know they would have, Grant answered without hesitation. My mother would have loved you immediately. My father might have been more reserved at first. He was a cautious man, but your determination and spirit would have won him over quickly. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Grant spoke again. I have something for you, a wedding gift, though I want you to have it now. From his pocket, he withdrew a small box and placed it in her hand. Madeline opened it to find a delicate gold pendant with a small diamond at its center. It was my mother's, Grant explained. My father gave it to her on their wedding day. Madeline touched the pendant reverently. It's beautiful. Grant took it from the box and fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin. It suits you. Madeline's hand went to the pendant, then to her grandmother's locket, which she still wore. Two treasures, Grant observed. One from your past, one for your future. Madeline's eyes filled with tears at the sentiment. I love you, Grant Nathanson. And I love you, Madeline Foster, soon to be Nathanson. Their wedding day dawned clear and bright, the October air crisp but not cold. The garden had been transformed with flowers and ribbons, and chairs arranged in rows for the guests' ranch hands, townspeople, and the few relatives who had been able to make the journey. In her room, Madeline stood before the mirror as her mother adjusted the veil in her hair. The dress they had created was simple but elegant, with delicate embroidery at the bodice and hem. You look beautiful, Rebecca said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Like an angel, Susan added from where she sat on the bed, already dressed in her best frock for her role as Madeline's attendant. Madeline smoothed the skirt of her dress nervously. I can hardly believe this is happening. Rebecca squeezed her daughter's shoulders gently. Your father would be so proud of you, Madeline. He made many mistakes in his life, but he loved you deeply. I know, Madeline said softly, and in a strange way I have him to thank for bringing Grant into my life. A knock at the door announced Mrs. Prescott, who had been designated to tell them when it was time. They're ready for you, Miss Foster. Downstairs, Grant waited at the makeshift altar, the local pastor beside him. He had never felt more nervous or more certain in his life. When the music began, played by one of the ranch hands who was surprisingly skilled on the violin, Grant straightened, his eyes fixed on the doorway. Susan appeared first, walking slowly as she'd been instructed, a basket of wildflowers in her hands. Then came Madeline on her mother's arm, and Grant felt his breath catch in his throat. She was radiant, her eyes finding his immediately as she walked toward him. The ceremony itself passed in a blur for both of them, though they would later remember the moment they spoke their vows with perfect clarity, promises made with unwavering voices and hearts full of love. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Grant cupped Madeline's face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of many guests. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with feasting, dancing, and toasts to the happiness of the newlyweds. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Grant took Madeline's hand and led her away from the revelry. Where are we going? She asked, following him willingly. I want to show you something, he replied, guiding her toward the stables. Inside, he led her to a stall where a beautiful chestnut mare stood watching them with intelligent eyes. This is Willow, Grant said, stroking the horse's neck. She's yours. Madeline gasped, reaching out to touch the mare's velvety nose. Really, she's magnificent. I thought we could ride together, Grant explained. Explore the ranch, maybe venture further sometimes. There's so much I want to show you. Madeline's eyes shone with happiness. I'd like that very much. Grant drew her close, wrapping his arms around her waist. Mrs. Nathanson, he murmured, savoring the sound of her new name. Are you happy? Madeline linked her arms around his neck, her face tilted up to his. Happier than I ever dreamed possible, Mr. Nathanson. Their kiss was interrupted by a discreet cough from the stable doorway. One of the ranch hands stood there, his hat in his hands. Begging your pardon, Mr. Nathanson, Mrs. Nathanson, he said, clearly enjoying the use of Madeline's new title, but your guests are asking for you. It's time for the last dance. Grant thanked him, then offered Madeline his arm. Shall we, my love? Lead the way, husband, she replied, her heart full to bursting with joy. As they walked back to the celebration, arm in the gathering dusk, Madeline reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the auction block to a bride, from despair to joy beyond measure. Grant had offered her freedom instead of ownership, but in choosing to love him, she had found something far more precious than either she had found home. 5 years later, the Nathanson ranch had flourished beyond all expectations. Under Grant's astute management, and with Madeline's support, they had expanded their holdings and improved their breeding stock until the Nathanson brand was recognized throughout the territory as a mark of quality. The house, too, had grown. Besides the addition for Rebecca and Susan, Grant had built a nursery adjoining their bedroom, a nursery that was now occupied by their 2 children. 3-year-old James, named for Grant's father, and 1-year-old Elizabeth, after his mother. On a warm summer evening, much like the one when Grant had first brought Madeline to the ranch, the family gathered on the porch after dinner. Rebecca sat in a rocking chair, knitting a sweater for James, while Susan, now 18 and preparing to attend a teacher's college in Denver, read a book nearby. James played with wooden blocks at their feet, constructing elaborate towers only to knock them down with gleeful shouts. Grant stood at the porch railing, Elizabeth in his arms, pointing out the stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The little girl, her dark curls so like her mother's, watched with wide-eyed fascination. Madeline observed them all from the doorway, her heart full of contentment. Coming to stand beside her husband, she slipped an arm around his waist. "What are you teaching our daughter, Mr. Nathanson?" she asked, smiling up at him. Grant turned, his face softening as it always did when he looked at her. "The constellations, Mrs. Nathanson. She's a quick study." "Like her father," Madeline replied, reaching up to smooth a wayward curl from Elizabeth's forehead. The little girl reached for her mother, and Grant transferred her to Madeline's arms. "And stubborn like her mother," he added with a chuckle. "I prefer determined," Madeline corrected, bouncing Elizabeth gently as the child began to yawn. "Papa, look," James called from where he played. "I made a ranch house." Grant crouched down to admire his son's creation. "Very impressive, James. You'll be building real houses before we know it." As darkness fell completely, Rebecca stood up, setting aside her knitting. "I believe it's time these little ones were in bed," she said, holding out her hand to James. "Come along, young man, time for your story about the cowboys and the Indians." James asked hopefully, taking his grandmother's hand. "If you wish," Rebecca agreed, leading him inside. Madeline followed with Elizabeth, who was already half asleep against her shoulder. Grant watched them go, then turned to Susan. "How are your preparations for college coming along, Susan?" he asked. The young woman looked up from her book, her eyes bright with excitement. "Very well, thank you. I can hardly believe I'll be leaving in just a month." "We're all very proud of you," Grant said sincerely. "And remember, this will always be your home," Susan smiled. "I know. And I'll write every week, I promise." When Madeline returned to the porch after putting Elizabeth to bed, she found Grant alone, gazing out at the land that had been in his family for 2 generations and would now pass to a 3rd. "She went right to sleep," Madeline reported, coming to stand beside him. Grant nodded, drawing her close to his side. "Susan's gone in as well. Your mother is still with James." They stood in comfortable silence, enjoying the cool evening breeze and each other's company. After a while, Grant spoke, his voice thoughtful. "Do you ever think about that day at the auction house? How different our lives might have been if I hadn't been there?" Madeline considered the question. "Sometimes. But then I remember something my mother used to say, that life has a way of bringing people to where they're meant to be, even through difficult paths." Grant's arm tightened around her. "Wise words, though I prefer to think it was more than chance that brought us together." "Oh." Madeline looked up at him, curious. "What then? Destiny, perhaps," Grant suggested with a small smile. "Or simply that 2 souls meant to find each other will always do so, no matter the circumstances." Madeline's heart warmed at his words. For a man who had once been so reserved with his emotions, Grant had become surprisingly eloquent in expressing his feelings for her. "However it happened," she said softly, "I'm grateful every day that you were there." Grant turned to face her fully, framing her face with his hands as he had on their wedding day. "As am I, my love, as am I." His kiss was tender, a reaffirmation of the love that had grown deeper with each passing year. When they parted, Madeline rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I have news," she said after a moment. Grant pulled back slightly to look at her. "What kind of news?" Madeline's eyes sparkled with joy as she took his hand and placed it against her stomach. "We'll need to expand the nursery again. By spring," Grant's expression transformed from confusion to wonder to elation in the space of a heartbeat. "You're certain?" he asked, his voice filled with emotion. Madeline nodded. "Doctor Miller confirmed it yesterday when he was here to check on Elizabeth's cough." With a whoop of joy, Grant lifted her off her feet and spun her around, his laughter echoing into the night. Setting her down gently, he kissed her again, pouring all his love and happiness into the embrace. "I love you, Madeline Nathanson," he murmured against her lips, "more than I could ever express." "And I love you, Grant Nathanson," she replied, her heart overflowing with contentment, now and always. As they stood together under the vast canopy of stars, Madeline reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From the auction block where she had stood in fear and shame, to the circle of Grant's arms where she had found love, respect, and a future brighter than she could have imagined. He had offered her freedom instead of ownership, but together, they had discovered something far more valuable, a love that had transformed them both, binding their lives and hearts in a bond that would endure through all the seasons of their lives. And as the lights of the Nathanson ranch glowed warm against the darkness of the Arizona night, Madeline knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, home, in every sense of the word, with the man who had not only saved her, but had taught her heart to fly.